Hi everyone. My book, Means and Ends, The Revolutionary Practice of Anarchism in Europe and the United States, has been released in America, and you can now buy a copy from AK Press directly or an online bookstore of your choosing. Today I'm going to read out the introduction to my book so that people who aren't familiar with its contents can gain some sense of its style and what the book is about. I hope you enjoy listening to it and buy a copy. The history of capitalism and the state is the history of attempts to abolish them and establish a free society without domination and exploitation. Revolutionary workers in the 19th and early 20th centuries believed that another world was possible. It is still possible today. One of the main social movements that attempted to overthrow capitalism and the state during the 19th and early 20th centuries was anarchism. Members of the historical anarchist movement not only attempted to change the world, but also produced an elaborate body of ideas that guided their actions. This book is concerned with explaining what their ideas were. Historians sometimes unearth old ideas from the past because they are an interesting way of gaining insight into a different time and place. This is not my principal motivation. I wrote this book because I want to live in a society in which everyone is free. I am convinced that, if we are to achieve this goal, it is important to know the history of previous attempts to do so. My hope is that, through learning about how workers in the past sought to emancipate themselves, workers alive today can learn valuable lessons and develop new ideas that build on the ideas of previous generations. How to define anarchism is a contentious topic and will be discussed in depth in Chapter 1. For the purposes of this book, it will be understood as a form of revolutionary anti-state socialism that first emerged as a social movement in late 19th century Europe within the International Workingmen's Association between 1864 and 1872, and the subsequent Saint-Omer International between 1872 and 1878. During and after its birth as a social movement, it spread rapidly to North America, South America, Asia, Oceania, and parts of Africa through transnational networks, print media, and migration flows. I will focus exclusively on anarchist collectivists, anarchist communists, and anarchists without adjectives who were agnostic about the nature of the future society, but advocated the same strategy as anarchist collectivists and anarchist communists. I do not claim that this is the one true form of anarchism, it is only the kind of anarchism I am focusing on. Anarchism, so understood, is one of the largest movements in the history of socialism. According to the historian Benedict Anderson, international anarchism was the main vehicle of global opposition to industrial capitalism, autocracy, latifundism, and imperialism during the late 19th century. Even the hostile Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm is forced to concede that, between 1905 and 1914, the main body of Marxists belonged to increasingly reformist, social democratic political parties, while the bulk of the revolutionary left was anarcho-syndicalist, or at least much closer to the ideas and the mood of anarcho-syndicalism than to that of classical Marxism. The vast amount of theory that the anarchist movement produced can be broken down into 5 main elements. 1. A theoretical framework for thinking about humans, society, and social change. 2. A set of ethical principles that form the value system of anarchism. 3. An analysis and critique of existing social relations and structures in terms of their failure to promote these ethical principles. 4. A vision of alternative social relations and structures that are achievable and would actually promote these ethical principles. 5. A series of strategies which are consistent with the ethical principles for abolishing existing social relations and structures in favor of the proposed alternative social relations and structures. Fully explaining each aspect of anarchist theory and how these ideas changed over time and varied around the world goes far beyond the scope of what a single book can hope to achieve. The aim of this book is narrower. I shall rationally reconstruct the revolutionary strategies of anarchism within Europe and the United States between 1868 and 1939. It is important to note that this exclusive focus on one part of the world is an artificial construction. The real historical anarchist movement was constituted by transnational networks that operated at a global scale and enabled ideas and people to flow between continents. The movements in different countries were so interconnected that a complete history of anarchism in Europe and the United States necessarily includes the history of anarchism in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, and vice versa. The true history of anarchism can only be written as a global history. My book is a contribution towards this global history, but only covers a small fragment of it. In order to rationally reconstruct the revolutionary strategies of anarchism, it is necessary to explain the other four main elements of anarchist theory: theoretical framework, value system, critique of existing society, and vision of a future society in depth. This is because what anarchists thought about strategy can only be understood within the context of anarchist theory as a whole. Although anarchists developed revolutionary strategies to abolish a variety of different oppressive structures, I shall primarily focus on their strategies to abolish capitalism and the state, since this is what most anarchist texts discuss. I shall, when it is relevant, include anarchist views on how to abolish patriarchy, but it should be kept in mind that anarchist men, who were the majority of published anarchist authors, did not give this topic sufficient attention. When explaining anarchist ideas, I will write in the past tense because, for the purposes of this book, I am focused on anarchism during one time period. Many of the ideas I describe are still believed by anarchists today and are not exclusive to the past, such as a commitment to anti-capitalism. I shall throughout this book refer extensively to, and quote from, a number of major anarchist authors who lived in Europe or the United States between 1868 and 1939. This includes, but is not limited to, Michael Bakunin, Elise Reclus, Peter Kropotkin, James Guillaume, Carlo Cafaro, Enrico Malatesta, Emile Pouget, Riccardo Mella, Luigi Gallini, Max Baginski, Voltairine de Cleyre, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Rudolf Rocker, Luigi Fabbri, and Charlotte Wilson. I shall supplement the quotations from major anarchist authors with quotations from sources collectively produced by the movement. These will include programs, Congress resolutions, and manifestos of formal organizations or affinity groups. In order to maintain a consistent style, all quotes are rendered using American English spelling. A key factor determining which authors I've chosen to include within this book is the fact that I can only read English. This is a significant limitation given that the majority of anarchist primary sources within Europe and the United States were originally written in languages other than English, mainly French, Italian, German, Spanish, Russian, and Yiddish, and have yet to be translated. As a result, there are authors who were historically important, but whose ideas I cannot examine in any depth due to lacking access to them, such as the Yiddish-speaking anarchist Saul Janowski or the Dutch anarchist de Mille Nieuwenhuis. Even with authors who have been translated into English, such as Reclus, I often only have access to a small amount of their total output. It should therefore be kept in mind that generalizations I make about anarchism are based on the primary sources available in English, and these represent a small fragment of the total text produced by the historical anarchist movement. I shall be quoting anarchist authors at length, rather than only rephrasing their ideas in my own words, because, in order to understand what anarchists thought historically, a modern reader must understand them on their own terms, and so through their own language and exact way of conceptualizing or expressing their ideas. Doing so will not only help ensure that my explanation of anarchist theory corresponds to what anarchists actually thought, but will also bring many obscure and not well-known passages to the reader's attention. Although I shall sometimes have to, for the sake of clarity and consistent terminology, introduce new language when summarizing anarchist ideas in my own words, this shall only ever represent a change in language and not a change in ideas. I shall, in addition, attempt to use the same language as historical anarchists as much as possible. Throughout this book, I shall not be arguing that anarchist theory was correct or interjecting with my own personal views on which anarchist authors or ideas were best. I will instead only be concerned with establishing and explaining what anarchist authors themselves thought. Through quoting these anarchist authors, I shall be rationally reconstructing the ideas of different thinkers into a coherent system of thought. A rational reconstruction is a reorganization of a set of ideas that highlights the logical relations between its different elements. A rational reconstruction of a political theory, in other words, not only explains what its exponents claim about various topics, such as how they think about society or the forms of action they advocate to change society, a rational reconstruction also makes the logical connections between the different elements of a political theory explicit, such as how their social theory underpins their choice of tactics. It is necessary to rationally reconstruct anarchist ideas in this manner for two main reasons. First, the vast majority of anarchist texts are short articles, speeches, or pamphlets. Even texts that were published as books are often compilations of previously published articles. Given this, an understanding of what an anarchist author thought can only be reached through assembling the many different ideas they espoused in different places. Bakunin, for example, wrote several sentences and paragraphs about freedom within texts concerned with a more general topic, but did not write an extended essay or book devoted solely to the subject of freedom. In order to establish what Bakunin thought about freedom, one must assemble a collection of short sentences and paragraphs made by him in several different texts. Even when an anarchist author did write about a topic in more detail, it is still necessary to combine different texts together because the positions advocated in one short article can be misunderstood or misrepresented when not connected to the claims made in other short articles. The ideas of the anarchist movement can likewise only be understood by assembling the ideas of a large number of different authors. Second, a key reason why anarchist authors wrote political theory was that they aimed to spread revolutionary ideas to workers and inspire them to rise up against their oppressors. This led anarchists to write in a style that was accessible to a wide readership, but could also make their arguments appear simpler than they actually were. For example, on numerous occasions anarchist authors do not explicitly lay out the conceptual connections between their different beliefs. Even when anarchist authors do claim that certain ideas are connected, they do not always explain why this is the case, or only explain briefly. Given this, it is necessary to rationally reconstruct anarchist ideas in order to build up the interconnected conceptual system that anarchist authors often left implicit or did not explain in sufficient depth. The technique of rational reconstruction is usually applied to explaining the ideas of a single individual author, such as Marx or Descartes. Such efforts must be sensitive to the fact that an individual author changed their mind or developed their ideas over time. It would therefore be a mistake to unthinkingly place ideas from one period of their life alongside ideas from another period simply because they were written by the same person. This issue becomes greater when rationally reconstructing the ideas of an international social movement over several decades. Assembling together the ideas of a large number of different authors is straightforward when explaining ideas that all anarchists advocated, such as the abolition of capitalism and the state, but is more complicated when examining areas where anarchists disagreed with one another, an idea significantly changed over time, or a whole new idea emerged during a specific historical moment and did not exist prior to this. A rational reconstruction of the ideas of anarchism as a social movement must be sensitive to the fact that anarchist theory was not a single, unchanging monolith, but a cluster of different tendencies in dialogue and debate with one another. While this study will utilize the conceptual rigor of philosophy to summarize the arguments of anarchist authors, it will not examine their ideas in a historically anachronistic manner as if they existed outside of time and space. To truly understand the political theory of historical anarchism, it is necessary to understand what these authors intended to mean and communicate to their audiences, and how their texts were, independently of these authorial intentions, understood by readers at the time. This requires locating texts within a specific linguistic context, inherited assumptions from previous thinkers, ongoing debates and discussions, how certain words were used at the time, etc., and the wider social, economic, and political world that these ideas were produced within and in reaction to, the social relations through which the production and consumption of goods were organized, what kinds of domination the ruling classes engaged in, how the oppressed classes resisted and struggled against their rulers, and so on. A comprehensive study of anarchism that fully contextualizes its ideas within the historical moment goes far beyond the scope of this book. I shall, instead, be focusing on a single main context, the history of the anarchist movement itself. This will include not only the theoretical debates within the movement, but also its various attempts at overthrowing capitalism and the state in favor of an anarchist society. This is because the revolutionary strategy of anarchism was articulated by members of a social movement in order to be put into action. It is furthermore the case that the ideas different anarchist authors proposed were developed in response to the ongoing experiences of class struggle, such as the various actions of different working class social movements, state repression of anarchist movements, and debates within anarchist organizations about how to act in a specific moment. In order to include this context, I shall combine a detailed textual interpretation of primary sources available in English with the secondary literature on the history of different anarchist movements in Europe and the United States. There are three limitations to this approach. First, the product of such a rational reconstruction will not correspond precisely to each individual author's viewpoint and will contain propositions that some of the authors I cite may have objected to because they disagreed with other anarchists on the topic. To minimize this issue, I shall, when it is relevant, point out when a view was distinct to a specific author and when there are important exceptions to a generalization. Second, this rational reconstruction will not exactly correspond to what the workers who composed the bulk of the anarchist movement thought. These workers were, after all, not automatons who blindly repeated word for word the ideas expressed by the major authors of anarchism. They had thoughts of their own about what anarchism was and about what anarchists should do. They may have, in addition to this, disagreed with my interpretation of the authors I cite, not noticed features of these texts that I have, noticed features that I have failed to, and in general gained different ideas from reading these texts than I have. It is furthermore the case that I will have read texts that individual workers within the movement were unfamiliar with, and that they would have read, or if they were illiterate had read to them, texts that I am unfamiliar with. It is difficult to find out what these anarchists thought because the majority of anarchists were not published authors and instead developed ideas through face-to-face conversations with their comrades. German anarchists in New York, to give one example, would discuss politics in a wide variety of locations, ranging from anarchist-run beer halls to singing societies to family picnics in the park. The contents of these conversations have unfortunately been largely lost when those who experienced and remembered them died, since only a tiny fraction of them were ever recorded in writing. Given this, it should be kept in mind that it is often unclear whether a major anarchist author is expressing ideas that they themselves came up with, or was merely repeating ideas that were developed through countless face-to-face discussions between anarchist workers. Influential anarchist authors themselves routinely pointed out that they were repeating ideas collectively developed within working-class social movements. To give one example, Malatesta wrote in 1899 that the anarchist socialist program is the fruit of collective development, which, even ignoring its forerunners, lasted several decades, and which no one individual could claim to have authored. Third, my reconstruction of anarchist political theory draws upon a small number of women authors. This is because, although large numbers of women played a significant role in the late 19th and early 20th century anarchist movement, most published anarchist authors appear to have been men. Of those anarchist authors who were women, many of them cannot be included in my rational reconstruction, since they either lived outside of Europe and the United States, such as the Chinese anarchist He and Jen, or they have not been translated into English, such as the Yiddish-speaking anarchist and doctor Katerina Yevzorov. Nor can my reconstruction, due to its focus on text, include the perspectives of those women who were active within the anarchist movement, but did not, as far as I am aware, have their ideas published by the anarchist press. This includes such individuals as the militant Concha Perez, who took up arms in the Spanish Revolution of 1936 and fought against fascists in Barcelona and on the Aragon front. Despite these shortcomings, a rational reconstruction of the ideas that can be found in the major theorists of anarchism who lived in Europe and the United States will provide a useful synthesis for thinking about the ideas that were prominent within the anarchist movement during the period I am examining. It should be kept in mind throughout that this reconstruction is primarily based on sources written by a small list of people who, despite exerting great influence on the movement, should not be conflated with the movement as a whole. Given this, when I write that anarchists thought X or anarchism holds that Y, I am not committing myself to the strong position that every person within the anarchist movement held these views, since this is not something I could possibly know. I am instead using these phrases as shorthand for the more modest claim that the major anarchist authors, newspapers, and programs of organization I cite did adhere to these views. The central argument of this book is that the reasons anarchists gave for supporting or opposing particular strategies were grounded in a theoretical framework, the theory of practice, which maintained that, as people engage in activity, they simultaneously change the world and themselves. This theoretical framework was the foundation for the anarchist commitment to the unity of means and ends. The means that revolutionaries proposed to achieve social change had to be constituted by forms of activity that would develop people into the kinds of individuals who were capable of and were driven to A. Overthrow capitalism and the state, and B. Construct and reproduce the end goal of an anarchist society. The structure of this book is as follows. In Chapter 1, I define anarchism in depth. In Chapter 2, I explain anarchism's theoretical framework, the theory of practice. With this in place, I rationally reconstruct anarchism's value system, critique of existing society, and vision of a future society in Chapter 3. The core ideas on strategy that were in general shared by the anarchist movement are described in Chapter 4. Chapter 5 reconstructs the anarchist critique of state socialism. Chapters 6 and 7 provide an overview of the two main schools of anarchist strategy, insurrectionist anarchism and mass anarchism. Chapters 8 and 9 expand the discussion of mass anarchism by explaining the history, theory, and practice of one of its main forms, syndicalist anarchism, which is a kind of revolutionary trade unionism. Chapter 10 continues the discussion of mass anarchism by describing the history and theory of organizational dualism, which was the idea that anarchists should simultaneously form mass organizations open to all workers and smaller organizations composed exclusively of anarchists. Chapter 11 summarizes the main ideas of anarchist political theory and reaffirms my central argument that the revolutionary strategy of anarchism was grounded in the theory of practice. I hope you enjoyed listening to the introduction to Means and Ends. If you want to listen to other parts of the book, I've linked to those videos in the description. If you want to buy a copy, physical or digital, you can do so directly from AK Press in America or AK Press in the UK. Again, links in the description. If you like my videos and want to support me to continue to make them, along with writing loads of books, please support me on Patreon. Thanks to everyone who has and continues to support me on Patreon. I wouldn't have been able to finish the book without your support. Have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.